Have you ever wondered how a conflict on the other side of the world could have such profound global repercussions? Today, we delve into the intricate fabric of history, to a significant event that left indelible marks on the world stage: the Vietnam War. The mid-20th century was a time of palpable tension, a Cold War era where ideologies clashed and nations were polarized. Right at the heart of this geopolitical maelstrom was the small, seemingly insignificant Southeast Asian country of Vietnam, divided by contrasting philosophies and global allegiances. To the north, we had North Vietnam, a state molded by communist ideals, influenced heavily by its powerful allies, the Soviet Union and China. It was a land where the red flag fluttered high, symbolizing a nation's desire for collective equality and resistance against colonial rule. Then, there was South Vietnam, a beacon of Western democracy in a region surrounded by the rising tide of communism. With the backing of the United States and other Western allies, South Vietnam stood as a testament to the allure of capitalism and the promise of individual freedom. These diametrically opposed ideologies were not merely confined within Vietnam's borders. They were a microcosm of a greater global divide, a reflection of the East versus West dichotomy that had come to define the era. The United States, with its staunch anti-communist stance, saw in South Vietnam an opportunity to contain communism's spread. On the other side, the Soviet Union viewed North Vietnam as a foothold to extend its influence in Southeast Asia. As the world watched, these two halves of a nation, backed by their respective global powerhouses, were on an inevitable collision course. The stakes were high, the tension was palpable, and the world waited with bated breath. And so the stage was set for a conflict that would define a generation. In the early 1950s, the first sparks of conflict began to ignite. A sense of unease was brewing in the heart of Vietnam. The year was 1955. The nation, split between North and South, was standing on the brink of a war that would echo through the decades. The North, under the banner of communism, backed by the formidable Soviet Union and China, was entangled in a fierce rivalry with the South, an ally of the West. The South, under the leadership of President Ngo Dinh Diem, stood firm in its resolve to resist the spread of communism, aligning itself with the United States and other Western powers. As the political tensions mounted, the initial conflicts began to surface. The North, led by the Viet Cong, a group of communist guerrillas, started to wage a series of guerrilla warfare against the South. The South, in response, fortified its defenses with the aid of the United States. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was a devastating reality. The war escalated quickly. The Viet Cong, with their unconventional tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain, proved to be a formidable adversary. They were relentless, undeterred by the superior firepower of the South and its allies. As the battles grew more intense, the involvement of international forces increased. The United States, a stalwart ally of the South, found itself deeply entwined in the conflict, sending thousands of troops to aid in the fight against the North. However, as the war raged on, it became clear that this was not a conventional conflict. It was a war of ideologies, a struggle between East and West, between communism and democracy. The world watched as Vietnam became a battleground, a microcosm of the Cold War itself. The war was not confined to the borders of Vietnam. It resonated globally, influencing international politics and shaping the world's perception of war and conflict. The stakes were high, and the world could only watch as the war unfolded, its outcome uncertain. In the midst of this escalation, the world watched with bated breath. The stage was set, the players in position, and the world braced itself for what was to come. Every war has its turning point, the moment where the tide begins to shift. In the Vietnam War, this moment came in the early hours of January 31st, 1968, when the North Vietnamese launched a series of surprise attacks known as the Tet Offensive. Named after the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday, Tet, these attacks were a calculated move by the North, targeting more than 100 cities and outposts across South Vietnam. What made the Tet Offensive so significant? It wasn't merely the scale of the attack or the surprise element, it was how this event altered the perception and narrative of the war, both within Vietnam and around the globe. You see, until this point the US government had been assuring the public that victory in Vietnam was within reach. But the Tet Offensive painted a different picture. The widespread attacks demonstrated that the North Vietnamese were far from defeated, and were capable of launching a coordinated, large-scale offensive, shattering the illusion of an imminent victory. Internationally, the Tet Offensive came as a shock. It sparked widespread protests against the war, particularly in the United States, where the public started questioning the government's handling of the conflict. This shift in public opinion pressured U.S. policymakers to reconsider their strategy and eventually led to the gradual withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. In Vietnam itself, the Tet Offensive had a profound impact. Despite suffering heavy losses, the North Vietnamese demonstrated their resolve to continue the fight, bolstering their morale. Meanwhile, in South Vietnam, the surprise attacks led to increasing disillusionment with the war and the government's ability to protect its citizens. The Tet Offensive marked a pivotal moment in the war, changing the course of the conflict and history. The ripples from this turning point can still be felt today, reminding us of the profound ways in which a single event can alter the course of a nation's destiny. The echoes of war often last long after the final shot is fired. The Vietnam War was no exception. Its end came in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, marking a pivotal moment in history. This wasn't merely the end of a conflict, but a seismic shift in global politics. Saigon's fall was more than a military defeat. It was the dissolution of a regime, the collapse of South Vietnam, and the birth of a unified Vietnam under communist rule. The war's end was a complex tapestry of joy and sorrow, victory and defeat, relief and apprehension. The streets of Saigon, once bustling with life, were now silent, bracing for the new regime's arrival. The aftermath of the war was a time of reckoning. The world watched as Vietnam began to stitch itself back together, a nation scarred but unbroken. The effects of the war, however, extended far beyond its borders. The veterans, these men and women who had fought with everything they had, returned home to a world that had changed. They carried with them not just the physical scars of battle, but the psychological wounds of war. The struggle didn't end on the battlefield. It continued in their minds, in their hearts, in their everyday lives. Perhaps one of the most haunting legacies of the Vietnam War was the use of Agent Orange, a defoliant sprayed by the US to clear vegetation and expose Viet Cong hideouts. But the impact extended far beyond its military purpose. The chemical has had devastating effects on the health of those exposed to it, causing cancers and birth defects that persist even today. The war also left an indelible mark on global politics. It reshaped the United States' foreign policy, underscoring the limits of military power and sparking a nationwide introspection that questioned the nation's role on the global stage. The Vietnam War may have ended in 1975, but its echoes continue to resonate. Its lessons serve as a stark reminder of the cost of war, the importance of diplomacy, and the enduring power of the human spirit to endure amidst adversity. Looking back, what can we learn from the Vietnam War? In the vast tapestry of history, the Vietnam War stands out as a stark reminder of the complexities of global politics and the human cost of conflict. Spanning 2 decades, from 1955 to 1975, this protracted battle between the communist North Vietnam and pro-Western South Vietnam left indelible marks on the world. Primarily, we're reminded of the devastating human toll. Countless lives were lost, families torn apart, and societies forever altered. The Vietnam War was not merely a political struggle, but a human tragedy that unfolded on an unimaginable scale. The power of public opinion also played a significant role. As the war raged on, so did the voices of dissent. Protests erupted across the globe, particularly in the United States, where citizens questioned the morality and purpose of their involvement. This public outcry, fueled by the gruesome images and stories emerging from the conflict, eventually led to a shift in policy, proving that the collective voice of the people can indeed sway the course of history. Moreover, the long-term effects of the war on Vietnamese society are still evident today. The land bears the scars of conflict, from the remnants of Agent Orange to the unexploded ordnance that still pose a threat. The socio-economic impact, too, has been profound, with generations grappling with the aftermath of a war that reshaped their nation. However, it's not just about reflecting on the past, it's about learning from it. The Vietnam War serves as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences of military intervention and the devastation that can ensue when diplomacy fails. It underscores the importance of understanding cultural nuances, the perils of underestimating an adversary, and the immense value of peace. As we reflect on the Vietnam War, we are reminded of the profound impact that such conflicts can have, not just on the countries directly involved, but on the entire world.